Little Tea Trauma, a limited series podcast by Lightcasting.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Little Tea Trauma podcast with your hosts, Krista and Laura. We are back here at episode 5. It's been about a month since we last talked to you and seen you. So we're going to get an update on what Laura's been doing in the last month and then get into our episode.
Laura's been going through it. So we've had eclipse season, haven't we? So it's been a time of growth. I feel like that's always the case when we have this little check-in. It's like, what have you been up to? Growth. Like going through it, dealing with stuff, up leveling. But yeah, I've noticed a bit of a theme again around, it bringing stuff up, like old patterns coming up, cycling back to certain, themes in our lives, and just kind of, again, shedding those layers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the eclipse season, again, this is not an astrology podcast, but it sounds like is bringing so much upheaval collectively and individually, and like even overnight.
Mm-hmm.
We're recording this on the 14th and there's talks of war now. It's just like it could not be any harder sometimes to be in the experience of our human evolution and just thinking like, I woke up this morning thinking like, why can't we just like not choose violence every day? That would be great.
Yeah, choosing peace and ease would be ideal.
Let's just choose peace every day. I think that's the best.
Yeah, well, we can only just do our little corner of the world, right? Like, gotta be the change we want to see in the world.
Yeah. Laura, aka Gandhi.
I know, I couldn't think. I'm thinking of Wayne Dyer. But yes, that's what we gotta do. So when we dreamed up this Little Tea Trauma podcast, it was almost called something else, because this is the topic that kind of was the catalyst for this kind of podcast coming to life. It could have been called Little Lettuce Trauma, because that's what I'm going to be divulging today, my little lettuce trauma. Iceberg. No, not iceberg. I forget which type. I think it actually might have been an iceberg lettuce.
Just giving Titanic vibes now.
Yeah. Well, that's it, right? Like, because the iceberg is like, you only see the tip of the iceberg. Same with our little tea traumas that trip us up. Like, we see the tip, that's what trips us up, but underneath it goes deeper.
There's a lot more. Mm-hmm.
Good analogy. All right, so shall we begin?
Yeah. Tell us all about your little tea trauma lettuce gate, as I was calling it.
So the year was 2012-ish. And I was at home, I was having a barbecue with some friends, and one of my friends, I was in Australia at the time, and one of my friends was like, oh, we're going to make a salad, a couple of different salads, but could you like chop up the lettuce for this particular salad? And I had this like debilitating moment when I was like, yeah, sure, like how hard can chopping up a lettuce be, right? But my 2012 version of me was like, how, right? Because I think when I make a salad for myself, like it doesn't matter how the lettuce is, but if I'm making like a salad that other people are going to be eating, and it was I can't remember what kind of salad it was going to be, but I just remember thinking like, how should I best chop up this lettuce? And I think like there's not that many ways that you could chop up a lettuce, right? But for some reason, this just really
unless you're British, and
it's just really stopped me in my tracks.
And there's like the queen's way of cutting lettuce, and then everybody else's.
Yeah, but I suppose like even with like a cucumber, right? Like there's a few various different ways you could cut a cucumber for a salad. If you're having a Greek salad, it might be more of the cubed variety versus just your regular garden salad. You might have more like the thin slices. So this was something that just like stopped me, and I was like, I can't possibly say to my friend like, how do you want it chopping? And also like, why am I defaulting to my friend to dictate how this lettuce is going to be chopped? Why don't I have the confidence to just be like, this is how I'm doing it? So that got me thinking at the time, and I was like, this is a bit of an abnormal response to be worrying, right? So underneath the little lettuce trauma was, I don't want to get this wrong, right? This fear of like not wanting to get it wrong. And maybe even like a sprinkle of shame of like, why don't I feel confident to just cut a damn lettuce for a salad? So that's where that begins. our topic today of exploring not wanting to get it wrong and the origins of that. I know this is something that's come up with a lot of clients in the past, and other, friends and stuff have had conversations with me over the years around this topic. So we just want to explore this today. And when I think back to, the origin of my little T trauma around, not wanting to get it wrong, what came up for me was, as often, goes back to something in childhood, something seemingly not too traumatic, but I had this vivid memory. It stayed with me for years. Often when we're doing self-work and healing work, we might revisit a certain theme or topic, right? So this has come up a few times in different ways when I've been doing some healing work. So I think it was primary school age. I was in class, and I've always loved writing. Consider myself a bit of a writer, and I actually used to love calligraphy as well. I used to trace different signatures and stuff, and be interested in that. So we were doing a writing exercise, and we had to go and show the teacher, go up to the front of class, show teacher. And this particular teacher, who I do remember her name, but I'm going to protect the not so innocent. And I think I'd gone up once or twice already, and she'd sent me back and been like, "Oh, that's not quite good enough," or whatever. And then I'd really tried hard. She's like, "No, you need to." I think it was when we were trying to join writing up and stuff like that. And I'd gone back, done it again, put effort in, because I used to put effort in at school. And then I'd gone back thinking, right, okay, this is going to be better. And she literally was like, "Laura, this is terrible. It looks like a spider has crawled across the page." She literally said that. I remember it to this day. The exact
that might
phrase.
Be where your fear of spiders has come from.
I don't have a fear of spiders anymore after living in Australia for 8 years, but not in the UK. I have a fear of Australian spiders still, but back in the UK where they're just tiny and can't kill me, it's fine. But yeah, and I remember that. And just, again, I guess there was going to be some shame there, her saying that. And I remember, and again, you stood at the front of class, right? And again, if I'd just not given a crap and just written whatever, but I'd literally put effort into that writing, that she was then going, "Oh, it just looks like a spider's crawled across the page. You're going to have to go back and do it again." And I remember vividly standing at the front, feeling this prickly, heat of, hello, Penny.
Sorry.
Krista's dog, Penny Moon, in the background. This shame, the heat of the shame rising. And God bless this classmate of mine. Still remember his name to this day, but again, I won't mention it. He was stood next to me, and he could obviously see or sense that I was upset, had more sensory awareness than the teacher. And he was offering me this reassurance and being don't worry, I think it looks fine, my writing's not great either, I've got to work on my writing. And I just remember that moment of compassion, from that other student, and how reassuring that felt at the time. Whenever that comes up for me is that moment of fear of getting it wrong, right? Amplified by being at the front of a classroom, so there's eyes on you, or you're thinking there's eyes on you even if there's not, and the shame mixed in with that, right? The shame of, oh, I got it wrong, and now I'm going to be, the spotlight is on me. And as an introvert, I've never been one for wanting unnecessary attention. So that's my little T trauma.
Yeah, those are really good. This happens, I think, to adults as well in different situations and things. But the thing that's interesting about the cursive thing is there is an element of whether the person can either model the behavior to you or criticize you, and taking that overly critical response to say that your writing looked like spiders. I don't know what she said. What did she say?
Spiders crawled across the page.
Yeah, I mean that's just so egregious, right? It's so unnecessary to even stab you a little bit more, and also you're a little kid, and you were trying your best, and I know that happens to adults, and I think that's why it's so important for us, when we're trying to teach people things, that we teach them in a modeling way versus a critical way. And that's I think a huge paradigm shift that we have seen kind of in the last couple generations, but it still exists there. And it's almost why do you have to turn the dagger in so much? It's just by saying that, it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah, totally. And again, thinking about it, it's that wanting approval as well, right? So we want people to approve of us, we want to fit in, we want to do things well and get things right. And like you said, there's a couple of ways you can go about that. But having compassion, or like, again, there's a time and a place, right? If it's a one-on-one situation and there was no one else in the room and she'd said that, maybe it wouldn't have had such an impact. But the fact that you literally stood, in front of a class of people, getting
And
this
everyone
kind of
can hear.
receiving this criticism. And when I've gone back into that moment in various different coaching or therapy settings, and one of the techniques I use with clients is to revisit certain traumas and look at them from different angles and show compassion and connect in with that version of our past selves. And it is just a contrast of how an adult might be, especially, again, like obviously time's passed, right? So in this day and age, maybe it'd be different and teachers have better training and stuff to not do certain things that they did in the past. But it always just has that kind of thing of someone in that position of authority, should know better, really, in those circumstances.
Well, and I think there's probably the element of like, if we're gonna apply compassion to little Laura, we also have to apply compassion to the teacher, because we don't know what she was going through. We don't know
Exactly
how many times she'd had to see kids, scribble writing. Like, I think, and to me, for me, teaching and parenting are the two most difficult positions to have in this life. To choose both of those paths, it's because it's very, very complex and hard, and it's repetitive too. So I think to apply that compassion both ways, but also we don't have to let her off the hook either, because this was a real experience of like how it made you feel. And I think talking about the shame and the embarrassment that you would have felt in front of that class would have really left like a physical reminder. Like, I'm sure when you think about that moment, like you can probably feel it somewhere in your body as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And like you said, having compassion, because when we know better, we do better, right? So like you said, who knows what was going off in her life that day? Maybe she was stressed. Like, we've all been in those situations, right, where we've like not been our best self or our most compassionate or understanding, because we're humans, so that's going to happen. But yeah, having that kind of insight to be like, yeah, that wasn't really ideal of that person to do that. And then of course whatever backstory was going on there taken into account. But obviously as a child in that situation at the time, like, we our child selves don't have the context, which is why, and again, like, often there's not that repair of someone sitting us down and kind of talking about it. And I probably never, I really don't think I ever probably mentioned that to anyone. I probably didn't go home from school and tell my mom, like, oh, Mrs. Mrs. X said this to me today. I probably just kept that to myself, right? And Gabor Mate often says, right, like, often the trauma is not what's happened to us, it's what happens inside of us as a result of what we've experienced. And if we've not spoken about it and shared it, which is why I think that classmate in that moment, like, thank goodness he was there, because without that, maybe that whole situation could have had even bigger impact, right? But at least he was there as that compassionate other in that moment.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you ended up like telling your parents, or did you ever, and even when you went back to those instances, I think you started talking about like how you were dealing with it. If you revisit that moment, like, is there any other insight you can provide to somebody if they want to go back and repair that part of their lives when they had this like real big, embarrassing, shameful moment come up?
Yeah, so it's like us being that compassionate other, right, in that moment. So if we're to drop into that, it's like, what did my 7, 8, 9-year-old self need to hear that day that she didn't hear? What did she need to feel that she didn't feel? And was there anything that she wanted to say or needed to say or express that she couldn't or didn't know how to, right? Which would be like, that's not very kind.
Or like, I'm doing my best and the teacher doesn't recognize it.
Yeah, I'm doing my best. And again, like, as a child in that situation, there was obviously the shame and whatever, but there would have been frustration at me trying to do something, right? And I'm still not getting it right. And then there's that bridge, right, between, well, if I'm trying my best and I'm not getting it right, then, I need help. And I think that's what I was finding frustrating. It's like, been turned back a couple of times and it's like, I'm doing my best here. I don't know where else to go from that point. And also maybe just like, linking back to the theme of not wanting to get it wrong, it's like, it's not the end of the world if you get it wrong, and it can be improved. But again, you need that kind of guidance or reassurance of like, here's what we need to do for you to improve this, or here's how you can improve this.
So thinking about that theme of like not getting it wrong, how do you approach that now as an adult where you are the one instructing yourself in your life? And there's no teacher there.
So a bit of procrastination will creep in from time to time still. Perfectionism. Like, oh, I'm just going to put this off because, like it's like, oh, I want to get it right, or I don't know how to do it right. So often we might notice procrastination kicking in, or that perfectionism tendency of like us delaying something. So the first step, obviously, with everything is awareness, right? Like recognizing that. And then giving ourselves permission to get it wrong, giving ourselves permission to write the shitty first draft or have the first go. And again, if we set that up for ourselves, right? So we're like, I'm going to try this. I'm going to have a first go at it. It doesn't matter if I get it right or wrong. It's just getting the ball rolling, right? Just sitting down and typing something on the page or, whatever it is that we're doing to do that. And then giving ourselves that grace and compassion of you don't have to get it. It's okay if you don't know what you're doing right now. You can ask for help. You can research it. You can find a framework somewhere. And then once you've got that, just step by step.
I recently had a work situation in the industry that I work in. There's a lot of perfectionists. There's a lot of type A people. There's a lot of like very erudite, accomplished people that work in our industry every day. And we had this situation where we were having to create a notification that was going to go out to very important people in the world. And a handful of our partners and colleagues didn't want to kick off this letter, and they wanted examples and they wanted somebody to show them through. It was starting to frustrate my own manager. And I just said I'll start it, because I don't ever have a fear of starting anything either. I just kicked off the letter. I don't know why anyone was so afraid to start it, but it's in that moment, I could see how they were struggling because they didn't want to do the wrong thing. It's a real thing to feel and especially in that pressurized environment, it's scary to be well, no, I don't want to take responsibility for this thing because what if I don't do it right? I'm just going to start it. And you know what? If it's not perfect, I don't care. And you know what? We're all going to get through it together. I put it out and we worked on it as a team, and it finally became something after a bunch of drafts. And I just think that was such a good example for me of not being afraid to start, because you feel when you get on the other side of really calming that perfectionist side of you, or that the perfectionist that has so much fear of doing the wrong thing, it really can, it just allows you, I think, a lot more room to try things, which is really important.
Yeah. It's funny though, right? As grown adults, how that can still show up for us. And as we were saying before, right, I work for myself, so I don't have, unless I, hire someone, that accountability or feedback from someone. So I can, procrastinate on something for as long as I want, technically. But if you're in that, corporate environment, or you're working with a team, you can't hide as much, right, with those things. And there's going to be other people that you're potentially going to have that fear of judgment or, criticism coming from. Because I think that's kind of what it links to, right? Fear of, or not, I don't want to get it wrong. It's well, what's the, why not, right? What's the consequence? What is it that you're scared of or afraid might happen if you did get it wrong, right? And it's judgment or humiliation, shame, being exposed as an imposter. Because I think that's another thing that comes up a lot for a lot of people in different environments, especially in the workplace, is imposter syndrome, right? That kind of fear of I'm going to be found out, that they're going to realize that I'm not as good as I, and it's not true. It's just that, what we talked about in the last episode of our inner critic sometimes getting in and having its say.
I think with the imposter syndrome, I think that people are trying to get away from that because it's usually ascribed to women. And so the goal is I know there's a lot of women like Katie Couric and Lisa Bilyeu, I can never say her name, and Reshma Mujani there, they come out and they've said we can't really do that anymore, because in the context of men are never feeling like they're imposters, and it's just one more way to break ourselves down as women to not be able to succeed and not be able to accomplish the things we want because we've then now put on this other identity that says like, I'm an imposter and I can't do this. And so I think it's important to like not take that on as an identity when you're wanting to try to do things, but still recognize that yes, you may have limitations at the moment that require you to look at them more deeply, or fears, or, like, because all of that is valid. But I think they're getting away from that as a whole, because it is just another way to bring the feminine down another level and basically undermine her success. So I think that's always really interesting that we're going that way now.
Totally. And I think on that point, I think men do have imposter syndrome. I just think women talk about it more, or they're more aware of it and they own it more. Whereas I think men kind of mask it more. And I agree what you're saying. I think it's probably less prevalent, but I think it does still exist.
You can just see, like, on social media, you don't really see it anymore. Like, it used to be everywhere, right? Like, imposter syndrome this, imposter syndrome that.
True.
Like, take
now
this course and you won't be an imposter.
Yeah.
And now you don't really see it anywhere anymore.
So, and we were talking before about shame, right? The shame element of being exposed or, and how that's really limiting. Because again, a big theme of, the purpose of doing this podcast is expansion, right? Like, how can we remove those self-imposed limitations and assumptions that keep us in a smaller playing field, so that we can actually shine and be who we came to be and enjoy life and enjoy those experiences that otherwise we're going to cheat ourselves out of, right? By focusing on those limitations and things. And we were saying how shame is such a shrinker, right?
Shame is one of those things that I think you can't go through your human experience and not feel it in some capacity. And I think depending on any segment of life that you are living, like, we all experience it, because I think the human experience is such that we're so relational, and a lot of us are unconscious. And so sometimes we get into experiences where we are the shamers, or we are the shamey. And that's just not a great place to be. I know Brene Brown's, our bestie, says that for, shame to thrive, it needs secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I think those three things, like you were mentioning that earlier, I think that's incredibly true, because even in your instance with the little lettuce thing, like, my question about whether you talk to your parents about it is like, you probably didn't feel, and I don't know, I'm just guessing right now, you can tell the audience or not, like, maybe you didn't feel comfortable telling your parents, and then so there was like the secrecy element, and then the silent elements came in it, and then whatever judgment you felt on those three things are the perfect storm to keep that shame cultivating within you, and then having it apply itself in different situations, because now you've experienced shame and you know what it is, and it's gross. I hate that we have to go through that.
But that's why it still echoes through time, right? So it's like, if we don't address that little T trauma, if we're not aware of it and we don't make that link, then it is going to keep recreating time and time again when you're in a similar situation, right? Where it's got similar components. Like you were saying with the situation at the work, with the project. I Googled the definition of shame. The definition. So it said, a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behaviour. And again, that's the assumption, right? Because often when we look back on some of these things that people would feel shame about, there is no wrong or foolish behaviour on their part necessarily, right? It's just
right, because they're doing it. And you're doing something or creating something in good faith, thinking that it's a good version of whatever.
Yeah. And then it's the meaning that we've ascribed to something, right? So it's like, we're taking someone else's comments, or and again, it doesn't even need to be verbal, does it? Sometimes it can just be that kind of sense that we get something, or a certain look, or whatever. That's really interesting about the secrecy and silence. Renee says, doesn't she? She's like, it's something that people don't really talk about, because it is one of the, like, we might talk about our sadness or our anger or our hurt or our grief. But the shame, like you said, it's kind of kept in this little secret box, and it's like, oh, God, can't tell anyone about this. But the funny thing is like, often when we do bring those things into the light, we expose the fact that it actually wasn't wrong or foolish, and we were carrying that secret shame around for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, exposing it to the light, I think, is everything. And I know that a lot of people have done this in the past, and I have too, is like when you experience shame, the more you experience it, the more you do hide it, and you don't want to talk to people about it. And it isn't until somebody has, I think, like the vulnerability, the courage and the bravery to say to you, like, I went through this thing and this is how it made me feel. And then you're like, oh, that's exactly what happened to me. And I'll say in my religious experience, this was very much a thing because in the religious experience that I had, there was also this idea of being humble, which was tied to humiliation and shame in a positive way, which is really like a really fucked up way to think about cultivating humility. Like it's one of those words that I hear now that still triggers me because it was like, you need humility. And it's like, in what kind of context do I need to be humiliated where it'll be good for me, like, and so in some ways too, there's also this, like, I would say, like, this underbelly of like, humility is good for you because it doesn't allow you to get, I think Australians say, like, tall poppy syndrome, like in the workplace or whatever. In other contexts, there's like ways where people want to break you down purposefully, like literally humiliate you to keep you small. Mm-hmm. And in my religious experience, it was tied to a religious, I would say, like a religious way people would look at you if you were somebody who was very, humble and endured humility well. Like, it's so gross. I hate it just thinking about it.
Well, I just typed it in, and the Cambridge Dictionary definition is, so the feeling of or attitude that you have no special importance that makes you better than others, lack of pride. And then the example, funnily enough, is Grandma was a religious woman of deep humility.
So, you think? Yeah.
But again, talk about shrinking, right? Talk about, and again, that's a form of control, right? So if we're shrinking and we're playing small, we're, like you said, like the tall poppy syndrome, it's like, you're not going to upset the status quo, right? You're not going to make too much of a ripple. Whereas if you were to feel, and again, there's difference between like the ego, overinflated arrogance, and that versus just being in alignment with your authentic self, and then having that positive impact that comes from that, and being able to show up and live your life in a way that is fulfilling.
I have a question for you about the shame piece. When you work with shame, either with yourself or with clients, what do you think is like the most important thing to address first? That just reassuring the person that they aren't their shame, or they aren't the circumstances around that shame, or is it more some other angle that you'd be working around?
Yeah, I think it's safety first, right? Because if someone doesn't feel safe, then they're not going to bring that secret shame box out into the open and even open up and see what's inside. So having that sense of safety and compassion, groundedness, to be like, whatever's going to come out of this box, you're in a safe space, and we can look at it and address it and look at that through that compassionate lens. So self-compassion in that scenario too. And then, like I said, often with the work excuse me, is looking at it from a different perspective, right? Because it's like we experienced something at a certain level and a certain perception, and then when we put that in the shame box, that is then the level that it stays, right? Because we're not telling anyone. The secrecy prevents it from. So often just in that two-way dialogue, bringing it into like with another person, it's got to be the right person, obviously, in the right setting, but often in doing that, you're straight away getting another perception on, another perspective on that thing. So then it's growing, right? You're like, oh, actually, yeah, it's not just this one thing that could only ever be looked at this way and only ever interpreted this way. We can actually look at it from a different angle and go, okay, right, well, now we're exposing, right? There is no need to be ashamed of this. There is no need to keep this a secret unless you want to for certain reasons. But kind of having that different perspective is very healing. And again, like obviously in a lot of work, that's what it's all about, right? Like selecting different perspectives and broadening your horizon, right? Like the opposite of shrinking. Expansion.
Sometimes when we keep the shame or the experience of shame or whatever it is that is making us feel shame, it's so amplified in our system if we're not talking about it and we're not addressing it. And I feel like sometimes over time it can become bigger. And I know we've talked about this a lot in a lot of the other episodes, but it's also like all the stories we're telling ourselves about that situation. And then it just like, it's like a snowball and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think you're right, having that safe space or having somebody who can safely at least listen to, what you went through without any judgment is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that point too, is like the impact it has on our self-concept, right? That our self-concept is everything. It affects how we show up in the world, how we relate to other people, and, what we're going to allow ourselves to experience and go for. And, we could be a really well-rounded person and be succeeding in lots of different areas and have healthy self-concepts in different areas of life. But if we know we're keeping this secret buried, right, it's always going to impact us, and especially in relationships of like, I'm not good enough, right? Like, oh, this is an amazing person, but I'm going to self-sabotage because deep down I'm scared they're going to like figure out that, I've got this big secret that I'm keeping, or that once they find out this thing about me, then, a memory just come to mind of another little an example of this is years ago when I was in Australia, I had some credit card debt. And it wasn't loads, but to me at the time, it was big. And I always kind of associated, credit card debt as like a bad thing, right? Something to be ashamed of for whatever reason. And I remember I was dating someone who I perceived to be quite, successful. And I thought, oh gosh, like if he knows that I've got this debt, then that was something I felt shame around at the time. And I just remembered that then, and I remember when I finally worked up the courage to say what was on my mind, because you could tell that I was keeping something that was bothering me. And he was like, what is it? And I'm like, I can't say it. I literally physically couldn't say the words. And he was like, well, I think we were driving somewhere. And he was like, well, we're not going to keep driving until you tell me what it is. And I was like, no, I can't. I physically can't bring myself to say it. And he was like, well, write it down then. So anyway, I did. And that then came out into the light, and it was like, oh, that's not a big deal at all. And I think that's often quite a common response people get, right? When they've kept this big thing that for them is like this big monster that's grown inside. And it's like, when you bring that into light with someone else, more often than not, they're going to be like, it's not even a big deal, right? It's not going to have the impact. Because probably what I was imagining was be like, oh yeah, he's going to think I'm this terrible person, or I'm not good enough for him now, or, whatever. And that just wasn't the case. So, and again, most people are walking around with their own little secret box, right, with something locked away in there too.
Or in your WhatsApp message with your friend.
Yes.
I was going to say something back there when you said, oh, what did you say back there? Oh, no. Yeah, I was going to say that I feel like as human beings, we love a good self-sabotage moment. We do it so unconsciously.
Yeah.
And the part where you were saying when you're walking around a little shame box, or you're hiding something about yourself that you feel could be a deal breaker in a relationship, friendship, work situation. I think because we're so close to ourselves, and we're so hard on ourselves as a species, I think this is a very common theme in the human experience. We don't realize how much grace other people give us that we should be giving ourselves in those moments.
Well, that was an interesting chat about where the little lettuce trauma went, around, not wanting to get it wrong, our fear of getting it wrong and the shame that can ensue. That theme of not wanting to get it wrong, again, is kind of links back to what we were talking about in episode 4 around, how to give less fucks, basically, right? So we did have a couple of listener questions or little things that got submitted, and we're just going to kind of link back to a couple of those. Over to you, Krista.
We got a bunch of feedback, but one of the ones was how can I stop caring what other people think? And I think this is such a big one. It's something that I had to go through in my own life experience because of the nature of me leaving my religious experience that was tied to my family, my community, and my friendships. And so I had to lose everyone all at once. And because of that, I had to train myself to stop thinking what people thought. Because in my religious experience, I've said this lots of times, there was a lot of judgment. The way that I practiced it for myself, not caring what people thought, and I think we said it in last episode, is the idea of it's none of my business what people think of me, and creating that sort of psychological and mental barrier to outside influence, and just coming back into yourself and reassuring yourself that all of the good qualities that you feel are expressed really strongly with you, anchoring yourselves in those things, no matter what's happening outside of the world. Because ultimately, people don't know who you are to your core, and everyone is going to have I would say, a skewed idea about who you are. Like even now, I'm sure me and Laura, there are people in our lives that think they know us, but they don't know the totality of who we are. They've made up some story. And same thing with Laura and I, with the people in our lives. Like we don't know everybody to their core being. So being able to really anchor yourself in who you are as a person, shutting out that outside influence, I think is incredibly important, and just come back into self-reference. That would be my advice. I don't know, Laura, if you have anything else you want to add there.
Yeah, I do actually. So first thing I would say is, we can never really know what someone else is thinking, right? It's often a projection. And I think we kind of touched on that in one of the previous episodes. So if we have no way of fully knowing what someone else is thinking, unless we're going to ask them outright, and even if we do, what they're thinking and what they can articulate or what they're willing to articulate could be two different things, is we can just decide, right? We can just assume positively of that person and just assign a positive meaning to what they're thinking, right? And I remember, I think it was Jack Canfield in his book, The Success Principles. I think there's a whole chapter on becoming an inverse paranoid, because he was talking about, a lot of us struggle with that paranoia of like, what are people thinking, or, whatever. And he was like, why don't you just assume that everything and everyone is conspiring in your favor and for your success, right? Because it's just a narrative, and what we think and focus on becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So why don't we do ourselves a favor and assume the best, right? Because then we're going to get the best of people, and occasionally that might be revealed, that there's a different angle, but 9 times out of 10, if we can assume the best and we then proceed with that, we're going to get a better outcome for ourselves and feel better, which is the key thing.
That's critical, because like you mentioned earlier at the top there, that we're constantly creating our own reality, and it all starts in our mind. Whether you believe the principles of manifestation or the power of words, or even just creating your own reality, like everything starts inside of us, and the world begins to reflect what's on the inside. And I think I had told Laura in our WhatsApp messages, I just completed a podcast interview with this lady named Lisa Tahir. And I've heard a lot about manifestation, and I don't know why she said this one thing that really, it was like a light bulb, because I feel like in some ways when you look at manifestation on social media or through people who are doing this, sometimes it's like these ideas are very bold and they're very in your face. But Lisa was talking about the power of affirmations in healing our self-concept and healing our past. And she was saying, if you hear a manifestation affirmation that sounds way too wild, like I want to be a millionaire tomorrow or something, that doesn't resonate with you, because you might be living in, a halfway house or a shelter or somewhere where you literally don't have money around you. And she said there's this nuanced baby step that you can take with yourself to literally affirm, my life is starting to change so that abundance can find me. A little change in the way you say it to convince yourself and to change your reality. I just thought that was so brilliant. And I know, Laura, you're more into this than I am, but I thought that was everything, because she was those little small affirmations are bridges to the big ones. And those are ultimately the bridge to where most people want to go, because it's hard to say I want to be here, or I want to be here, but I'm right here. And there's a bridge there, but how do you get there? It's like a bridge of 1,000 steps,
Yeah. And I think with this, again, it can be summed up right in that theme of, okay, who am I and who am I becoming? Because we're not static, right? We're not stuck where we are. Unless we never do any work or any self-reflection, or but even then, we're still going to get carried along with the the tides of time moving along. So if we can focus on who do I want to be, what do I want to experience, and then who am I becoming, right? And I think that feeds into those affirmations, right? I am starting to believe, I am starting to become, and just again, it's that expansion of the perspective, right? So it's okay, we've had this perspective all our lives, and that's been upheld by beliefs, and then that's created that feedback loop. Then it's okay, so what do I want instead? And starting to then cross that bridge.
Yeah. So last one here that ties into the whole episode, which is, and I think we'll tie into the boundaries conversation we had a couple episodes again, but how do I deal with somebody who has willingly humiliated me? So I don't know if you want to answer that one first, or whatever you want to do.
That's a good question. So I'd be digging into, okay, so they've willingly humiliated me, like in what way? Like how specifically? What was it that's potentially triggered? And then obviously, like you said, linking back to boundaries then of who is this person? Like where are they in your, circles? I think we've covered that in a previous episode, right? Like in terms of, is this someone you can literally walk away from or remove from your life, or is it someone that you're going to have to have in your life in some capacity? And then how can you become comfortable in setting that boundary, right? Because it's like, okay, people are going to be people, but we can say that's not okay with me, right? And then draw that boundary and make that request for change behavior, remove ourselves if it's something that we're really uncomfortable with and if that's a possibility. But that's where I would start.
I would say same thing as well. And I think like you and I, we've talked about this a lot in our WhatsApp messages, that as we've gotten older, as we've evolved, as we've had more wisdom and more experiences, like that threshold of how often we would let somebody disrespect us, it shortens real quick, the longer you are in practice of this. And I think it's such a beautiful practice to, if someone is humiliating, yeah, I would have humiliating you. I would have those same questions like, who is this person? Like, is this a pattern that they're creating in the dynamic of your relationship? And why is that? Are they gaining something from that? And do you need to protect yourself from that type of energy, that type of behavior? And if the answer to those questions are yes, then you definitely need to push them out into the rung. I think where those kinds of things can get kind of hairy or messy is if it's in a family system or in a toxic relationship. So we don't know for this person, like who she's specifically talking about. But I would say like, it would be easy if it was just like an acquaintance or somebody that you worked with, not regularly, like you could really put up those boundaries. But it would get more complicated, I guess, if we knew if it was like a family member or a partner or something like that. That would be the only thing. We wouldn't be able to sort of give any advice here on that specifically.
So yeah, it's a conversation, isn't it, around why that's not okay, and that request for change. Because this person saying like, how do I deal with it, right? So it's like they're not okay with it. They know they're not okay with it. Because I think, like linking to what you said, sometimes if we've been in those toxic situations, especially if it's family or relationship, we become a kind of like not immune to it, but like we just keep ourselves in those situations sometimes. If we have a story that, for whatever reason, we can't remove this person, or again, if it's sometimes like a lifestyle thing, or there's something pinning us with that person, and it just seems like, how can I actually, how can I remove myself from this person? Like, I think sometimes people want to, but circumstances dictate that they can't. So I think addressing that with the person, like having those clear boundaries, and then also like linking back to the shame component, is bringing someone else into that picture, right? Telling someone else, I'm having this struggle, or I'm having this challenge with this person. Like, can you support me, right? Like, even if it's just someone that knows what the situation is and what's happening, so we can have allies, right? Because I know in the past, when I've encountered those situations, and it was in a situation where I felt I couldn't remove myself at the time, and it just become the norm of that kind of treatment, because I didn't feel I had leverage at the time to make those requests. I'd probably made them and then they'd gone unactioned. And again, in certain dynamics, people have a tendency to overlook things, right? So they might assume that you're okay with that, or people feel uncomfortable to call someone else's shitty behavior out. But for me, I found a lot of, support when people actually started noticing what was happening and saying that's not okay, right? In that time when I didn't have my own voice to say, or didn't have my own leverage or power to say that's not okay, having someone else as like an ally to be like, what are you doing? That's not okay. And calling that person out, rather than that like complicit situation that can happen sometimes, right? Where we observe someone getting treated poorly or being humiliated, and for whatever reason, don't say anything. So I think that's important to put into the mix.
Yeah. Awesome. I think we'll leave it there because we're almost out of time here. So you guys can always leave us little Spotify voice notes. We still haven't got one. We're still waiting for one. And you can send us your questions on our DMs on Instagram, or at a little T trauma podcast at Gmail if you have any questions. we did this as a limited series, so we've got one more episode left next month, and then that will be the conclusion of this beautiful collaboration that we've been doing. So we're looking forward to wrapping it all up in a nice bow for you guys and having a good last episode. Laura, I could get back over to you to say anything on our closing remarks here.
Nope, nothing else to add apart from looking forward to our final episode. And if anyone's got any questions they want to submit on this particular topic or any of the other 4 episodes that have gone out, then shoot them via email or to, like Krista said, via our DMs or the voice note feature on Spotify. And we'll get to some of those in that final episode as well.
Good. All right, guys. We'll see you next month.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening. If you have a little T trauma you'd like Laura and Krista to help you with, send it to littlettraumapodcast@gmail.com to have it featured on the show. Make sure to rate, review, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow Little T Trauma on the Lightcasting YouTube channel. Little T Trauma is a Lightcasting production. Music by Score Wizards. Editing, directing, and post-production by Krista Ziomata. Lead vocals by Laura Forbes and Krista Ziomata.